Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to talk about race today, which is, in my opinion, one of the more important topics that we have, and a topic that anthropology is uniquely situated to discuss. Because when you're discussing race, talking about race, it really is something that combines the biological and the cultural. And so, respectfully to other groups other scholars who do excellent work on the topic, I think it's important to note that to really dig into race, you have to sort of incorporate both the biological and the cultural, especially because we are still under this very failed notion that race is this really meaningful biological category. And as we're going to talk about today, it's really not. And that's why I call this talk the long history of a bad idea, right? And it's a conversation that we need to have and that we're not. It is, for a very long time now, something that has been circling in our nation that for years now we've been having issues with discrimination, with prejudice, with racism, with race relations, with poor treatment, and this has become even more pronounced in recent years, I would say, with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the things that have taken place and all of the things that will take place between the time that I record this video and you watch it, unfortunately, right? And so this is something that is long overdue for us as a culture and as a people. And so I think it's important that we talk about it, right? So to start with, what is race, right? What is this thing that we're talking about, I always have students laugh when I show them a Wikipedia page, but the truth is most people, when they don't know something, Google it today. You and I both know that. And 9 out of 10 times, what's the very first page that comes up? Wikipedia, right? And so although it has a lot of issues, this is where people sort of go to find stuff, right? And so according to Wikipedia, race is a grouping of humans based on shared physical or social qualities. Well, that's an interesting thing there. One, they're talking about physical qualities. So as we discussed last time, well, there's a difference between genotype and phenotype. And so if we're just looking at phenotype, we're not really looking at something that is all-encompassing when it comes to the biological reality of an organism. Okay, so first off, that we do look at the physical, and that's a problem, as you guys have learned, right? The social qualities is really interesting there, right? That we today don't tend to think of it that way, right? First used to refer to speakers of a common language, right? Centuries ago, it was sort of like, it's something that a lot of racists don't realize when they say, oh, well, people have always been this way. Well, no, they haven't. Even the historic record, we see the fact that you and I could have this different skin colors, but if we spoke the same language, we lived in the same region, we ate most of the same food, then you and I were one thing, right? Rome is a great example of this. While Rome's history is long and complex and convoluted and stuff, throughout a lot of Roman history, Romans saw each other as what matters is we're Roman. It doesn't matter if what you look like or whatever. You and I are Roman, then we're the same thing, no problem, right? And so speaking a common language, or as it says here, a national affiliation, right? But by the 17th century, race began to refer to these phenotypic traits, right? Which is something that we're still carrying with us today, this idea that these phenotypic expressions are what's meaningful and what we should really be drawing sort of boundary lines of for human beings, which is very problematic, right? In the U.S., we have a long history of classifying race, and the best example of this is actually the U.S. Census, okay? We've always sort of gathered this because, of course, it was quite meaningful as to who lived where and things like that for voting, okay? And so this was where southern states, quite smartly, although quite evilly in my opinion, came up with the 3/5 clause. And because of the 3/5 clause, the southern states were overrepresented in American political power throughout most of our history, because since an African American counted as 3/5 of a person, it gave them more seats in the House of Representatives. However, those seats didn't actually represent people that could vote, so a very, very few number of whites had a hell of a lot more seating than they would have, and certainly than they did in the North, which weren't slave-owning states, right? And so the census was always very concerned with race. so that we could sort of appropriate house seats, right? But just to give you some examples of the ways in which we've had a kind of sliding understanding about what race is. In 1890, we have white and black, of course, right? Mulatto, which referred to a mixed race, usually even black and white, although, of course, that person did not have any kind of privileges that white people did. Quadroon, which was a quarter black by descent, and octoroon, which was 1/8 by descent. Now, why was this meaningful? Because from a legal standpoint, if you were 1/8 black or more, then you were black, period. You couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office, you couldn't, do all of those things throughout American history. Once you crossed that, then you could be considered white, although realistically, from a social perspective, if it was known that you were any part black, you weren't going to be able to accomplish things or, hold office or, do business or these kinds of things, right? And then Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. And that refers, of course, to actually Native Americans, like from North America, not Indians as in from the Indian subcontinent, right? By 1920, that had changed. We kept those pretty solid for a while. White, black, mulatto, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Hindu, Korean, and other. Now, again, this is a perfect example. Hindu is a religion. It's not a people, right? They, of course, were using it to refer to Indians from the Indian subcontinent, even though there's, millions and millions of Muslims and Christians and things like that. India has always been an extremely diverse nation and those kinds of things, right? So by 1960, it was white, Negro, right? Again, reflecting what was seen as, frankly, a positive change. At the time, Negro had become the preferred word, the preferred term to use, as much later African American would. And then more recently, we've seen a movement away from African American because it sort of excludes those individuals who are dark-skinned, but maybe don't trace their lineage to Africa inherently. And also many Black Americans prefer the term Black American, as they say, I'm an American, I'm not African, Again, there's a lot of different preferences here that individuals have. I respect that, right, as to how we form our identity. Sometimes you'll hear white people that get worked up about this, and it really cracks me up because my family came here from Ireland in the 1820s. If I chose to refer to myself as Irish American, probably none of you would care. I don't. I don't prefer to be called Irish American because I've never been to Ireland. I have no connection to it, and so I just prefer American. Everybody goes, yeah, that's fine too. And so it's an interesting thing that when you are in the dominant, sort of politically, socially, power structure-wise dominant culture, you're kind of allowed to massage your identity in a way that we oftentimes don't allow for those cultures that live among us that don't have that political power, right? So white, Negro, American, Indian, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and other, right? By 1980, it was American, Indian, or Alaskan Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, white, and there were two ethnicities that were listed, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. This has, again, been something that a lot of people don't like. I remember talking to friends and stuff in like the 2010 census when it was the same thing. They said, well, what's your race? And in parentheses on the census, it said Hispanic / Latino is not a race. And a lot of people that I know that are Hispanic or Latino are like, yes, it is, right? Well, the problem here is because we're making it up, right? And so is it not? Well, it's an ethnicity. Well, what's the difference between an ethnicity and a race, right? What you end up finding is that in many ways, as people have become more cognizant of the fact that race is not meaningful biologically, they've simply substituted the word ethnicity in there, right? And so, there's a lot of debate about this. There's a lot of arguments about this as to, what it ought to mean, right? By the 2010 census, you have white, Black, American Indian, or Alaskan Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, right? Now, this does get into some kind of tricky issues and some thorny issues. For example, immigration policy in the United States, right? It's important to remember that even as we are having a conversation today about what it means to be Black in America, what is the treatment of Black or African Americans, a conversation we desperately need to have, it's important to remember that other quote unquote races have also faced a tremendous amount of struggle in this country. A great example of this is Asians, in particular, people from China. The very first exclusionary law we ever had, the first law America ever passed that said those people can't come here, was actually the Chinese Exclusion Act that said it was illegal for most of them to come. It set a cap on how many individuals could come from China. It also said that only men could come and not women, because, as is true throughout American history, we have a desperate need for immigrants, right? There's a lot of studies that have been done on this that have demonstrated the economic importance of immigrant populations, even up until the modern era. One study that looked at that was funded by the Small Business Administration found that 25% of all small businesses in the United States between, I think it was 1990 and 2015, if memory serves me, I'd have to look it up. But through a good block of the 90s and the early 2000s there, 25% of all small businesses were started by immigrants. Small businesses are still the number one employer in the United States, right? It seems like everybody works for, Walmart, Amazon, and, Target. But the truth is it's small businesses that are driving a lot of employment opportunities in the U.S. And so much of the more recent narrative of this, recent narrative of immigrants stealing jobs, it's not a recent narrative. It's an old narrative, and it's an old failed narrative, because immigrants have always been a part of our economic engine. And some of those small businesses that were started in that time period, by the way, didn't stay small. So Google, for example, was co-founded by an immigrant and is routinely considered to be like the best employer in the United States, right? And so this narrative is a lot more complex than 30-second sound bites on cable news might lead you to believe, right? And so going back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, we started with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We allowed men to come, but not women. And the purpose was, and I mean, this is all in the congressional record and stuff, the purpose was we needed those men to come. We needed them to come work. We needed them to build railroads. We needed them to build roads. We needed them to build bridges. We needed that labor. But we did not want them to stay. And so the thinking was, if we said men can come, but not women, and they used really racist language to say why women couldn't come, because they said things like they were all prostitutes and they'd spread disease, and just really racist stuff about Asian women. But they said that they didn't want them to come because that way the men would come, work, earn, and then they'd leave. They wouldn't settle here. And the fear was if women could come, maybe, families would come, men would come and bring their wives, they'd have children here, they'd start communities here, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so much of what you saw in these narratives about Chinese, quote unquote, really Asian more broadly, later on gets applied to Latinos in particular. And even before that, much of this kind of got off the ground by referring to even Europeans that were seen as less desirable. So, for example, the Irish or Italians, right? Or things like that. So none of this is new. We've been dealing with this for a long time, or at least, it's been here for a long time, even if we haven't been dealing with it, right? It also did have some interesting ramifications because in the 20th century, one of the interesting things that was done was to say, well, we're going to set immigration limits, and we're going to set those limits at whatever percentage of the population this group was in, say, the 1890 census or the 1900 census or the 1920 census, right? One of the things that did was really limit Indian populations to come here, as in from the subcontinent, what in 1920 was called the Hindu race, right? At the time, India was a colony of Great Britain, like so much of the world had been at one time or another, including us. And because of that, of course, India wants, resources and labor England wants resources and labor in India, and so they didn't allow their people to immigrate. They didn't allow individuals to leave, and so Indians had very, very low immigration numbers in the United States in 1920. And so fast forward 40, 50 years after independence, but the U.S. is still saying, well, no, you were, whatever it was, 1% or something, 1.5%, and so that's all that can come here, right? So this has long-reaching consequences that still have some impacts for us today. Okay. So the question then becomes, is race in the genes, right? Even as we have this floating definition that sometimes it's a country, sometimes it's a nationality, sometimes it's a religion, sometimes it's your skin color, right? Today, I think you'll find that most people, if asked what race is, they're going to talk about skin color. They're going to say if you're black, if you're white, if you're, whatever. So is it in our genes, right? Daniel Fairbanks, really great writer, really amazing book. If you're interested, Everyone is African, just came out a few years back. Said, quote, research has demonstrated that the genetic variation associated with what most people perceive as race represents a small proportion of overall genetic variation. When viewed on the global scale, there's no discrete genetic boundaries separating so-called races. What he means there is that there is no line that you can draw and say, yep, this is white people, this is black people, this is Asian people, this is, when you look at the 3 billion base pairs of our genetic code, it's just not possible to do that, okay? And this is an example of the genetics that I was talking about before. When we were discussing evolution, I had said that one of the things that you see is what's called the founder effect, right, or genetic drift, right? That you lose some genes anytime you take a large set and then pull down a small set. I'd use the example of marbles, right? Well, that's exactly what happened, because all of us evolved 200,000 years ago in Africa. And as one small group left, and then that group sort of broke off into a smaller group, and then that broke off into a smaller group, and these kinds of things, you see this take place, which is all of the genetic potential in humans is found in African populations, right? The blue circle on your screen. A subset of that, of course, then sort of broke off and went to Asia, which is that green circle. Another small set sort of broke off and went to Europe, which is that orange circle, right? And so in all of this, you see exactly what we would expect to see if we all belong to the same race, which we do, which is that we are, all the genetics are sort of overlapped with one another, right? They're all sort of intertwined there. This is a map of sort of skin color itself, of sort of light and dark and stuff. And this isn't the best map because it does look like there might be ways to sort of, draw lines around it. This is an actual map of what the common skin colors, are there, right? You'll notice that there's nowhere that you can really say, like, that's it, that's the hard line, that's where white stops and black begins. Like, yes, along the equator, you're going to see darker skinned people, as we talked about, because of UV exposure to sunlight. But even then, I mean, look at Africa and the really northern reaches and the really southern reaches. People are pretty fair skinned, right? When you talk about North America, right, there's a gradation from lighter to darker, and then lighter again once you get down into Patagonia and South America, right? Even in Europe, it's not super easy to see on this map because it's small, but even in Europe, there's a gradation from Northern Europe to Southern Europe in terms of skin color. There's just nowhere that you can draw that line and say, there it is, right? It simply doesn't exist. And this is, in fact, skin color. This right here, these 22 letters represent skin color. That's it. Out of 3 billion letters that make up you, these 22 are all that make up skin color. That's pretty underwhelming if you ask me. As I always point out, there's a hell of a lot more genes that control like the shape and color and stuff of our eye. It would make a lot more sense to like sort of divide the world up and say, oh, yep, those are brown-eyed people. They're a totally different race than green-eyed people, or what the hell ever else you want to say, right? It's nonsense, right? It's just too small of a percentage. Does it have an impact on our biology? Yes, it has an impact on the expression of melanin in our skin. But the idea that that would divide us into separate groups is just asinine. It is so statistically insignificant that no sane person can argue that race is this biologically meaningful concept, right? And we see this again when we look at the grouping of alleles that we talked about before, those kind of pairs, alleles in geography. One study found that 92% of alleles are found in 2 or more regions, right? Meaning that they sort of broke it up continent-wide as a meaningful region, and they said 92% of them are found in at least 2 of the continents. Like half of them are found on every continent, right? Half of our genes are found in absolutely all of us. There's not that much of a difference between us, right? And this is something that anthropologists have been talking about for a very long time. Franz Boas was an immigrant to the United States, and he was kind of the first PhD anthropologist here at Columbia University, and he trained this first generation of really great anthropologists, from Margaret Mead to Ruth Benedict to everybody else, right? And he was really fighting against the racist notions of his time. And so they said, well, the races are real different. Look, it's not just skin color, it's like head shape and brain capacity and all of this other stuff. What was really cool about Franz Boas is in the very early 1900s, I mean, deep Jim Crow law is still in place and legalized segregation and stuff. He really fought against this, saying that, head form changes. You're going to say this is the head form of people, but he said, look at what happens with immigrant populations, right? Their head shapes change over time, over generations. One of the other things that he documented was looking at height. And so he was looking at a lot of sort of Eastern European immigrants that were coming to the United States at that time. They were coming out of areas of profound poverty. There really wasn't a lot of available land, things like that. And so these are agricultural people, they're farming people, and many of them were suffering from malnutrition. And what he showed was when they came to the United States, where we had so much land, we would just give it to people, right? That's how my family came here. They homesteaded 180 acres, right? And they're like, if you farm it, you can have it, hell, what he found was that their offspring were like one standard deviation taller than them, because for the first time they had land. It's like, hey, if you'll work hard, you can grow all the food that you need. You can get ahead. You can be, and their kids showed that because of that availability of better quality nutrition. They're bigger, right? They're not stunted in their growth because of this, right? And so anthropologists have been doing this for a very long time. A professor of mine, Lance Gravely, was lead author on this paper, looking at this 100 years later, I think, or almost, looking at cranioplasticity that Boas had looked at, and found that while Boas didn't do everything right because a man of his day, he didn't have the scientific instruments that were necessary, overall he found that Boas was absolutely correct, right? That this idea that white people had bigger brains, he's like, no, cranial size is related to height, excuse me, and that's going to change based on nutrition and all of these other factors and stuff like that, and really demonstrating that this was kind of a nonsensical concept. Besides the fact, let me hasten to point out too, the size of your skull doesn't have anything to do with how smart you are, right? It has, intelligence is about everything from brain complexity and all of these other things. But having a bigger skull means you have a larger hat. It doesn't mean that you actually are smarter, right? But he was able to demonstrate that yeah, this was way more sort of fluid than we thought, so it wasn't sort of fixed in place. Height or brain, or excuse me, skull shape or skull size, or all of these other different measurements that we want to talk about. All of them are much more malleable than we first realized, And so one of the cool things that this does demonstrate, though, looking at the genetics, is the fact that we all are one species. We all derive from a population of Homo sapiens sapiens that evolved in Africa, and it's in kind of Central East Africa, right at about 200,000 years ago, give or take 1,000 years or so, right? And we do this by tracking what's called haplogroups. And haplogroups are a set of very closely linked DNA sequences that are sort of passed on together because different genes do different things, different genes are linked to different genes, and so certain genes are passed on with one another, right? It's sort of a cohort. They're all hanging out together. And so we're able to then look at those haplotypes or those haplogroups and say, okay, these things get passed on. And so we can look for these things and be able to see real specific changes. What the rate of mutation is on these genes is well understood, this kind of stuff. We'll look at Y DNA haplogroups, which of course are passed by the male, right? Because mom has two X chromosomes, dad has an X and a Y, as you guys remember from high school bio. And then they'll also look at mitochondrial DNA or mDNA, which is of course the mitochondrial is passed from female to female. So it's passed from mother to daughter, not to son, but from mother to daughter, right? And on and on. And then that daughter passes it, right? And so we're able to sort of track these different lineages. And when we do that, we're able to construct a map that is really the expansion of our species around the globe, okay? And so you see these different groups up there. I've got a couple more maps that show the same thing, a little easier to read, right? And so they're assigned numbers, they're assigned letters, just, sort of A through Z as we break them down. And then sometimes we'll, break those down into smaller groups. And so you might have, M1, M2, M3, those kinds of things. And we're able to sort of see this roadmap of human expansionism, right? And again, showing that we are all linked as one species, okay? No human beings anywhere evolved separately, which is another thing that was a really common thought of, well, maybe we were all humans, but we evolved from separate populations, like humans evolved more than once, the way that, say, writing evolved more than once. That turns out to be utter nonsense, despite claims that you'll hear occasionally from racists that want to say that, or from even governments that have a political agenda. So the government of China, their official policy is that the Han Chinese people evolved in China completely separate from Africans and Europeans and stuff like that. They do that for strictly political reasons and claims of superiority and ideas about land tenure. So this justifies them taking things like Tibet and stuff like that, say, oh, well, this has always been our land since we evolved, 150,000 years ago or whatever, right? But it's nonsense, right? It's just not the reality that we see, And again, we're able then to look at this by tracking the changes that we know happen over time and the rate with which they happen in the evolutionary process, to help us establish when potentially groups moved into these areas, right? So, 100,000 years ago, you see the first populations moving out. Some of these numbers, actually, I think this map it's a few years old and we've refined a little bit. We were in Europe a little bit longer than that and those kinds of things. We were probably in the New World, the Americas, a little bit before that, right? But nonetheless, right, as our techniques get refined, then our knowledge gets refined. It's one of those things that people don't understand about science, and it can throw them off sometimes because we'll say something and a year or two later be like, we were wrong. And they go, oh, well, see, do these guys even know? Yeah, we do, but we got new information, so we're doing better. Like, as I talked about with Darwin, Darwin's ideas were revolutionary. We do a lot better than he did because we have new techniques, right? So this is the sort of time map of how we spread out around the globe, and this is actually supported with not just the genetic evidence, but the archaeological evidence supports this. Even linguistic evidence, as we have learned how to understand how language changes over time and how language will change when it spreads from one region to another, and being able to track the influence of language A to language B to language C and stuff like that. All of this evidence agrees that this is exactly the model, like I said, give or take some time in here, that we're looking at with human beings, So all of this is to say that race is a social construct. It is not a biological one. Biologically, it is not particularly meaningful. It is not a big deal in terms of how you could sort of divide human populations up. Rather, it's a social idea, and as I've talked about, that has changed over time from race going from maybe nationality to a shared language, which is still an idea that's around. I remember reading a paper about the Maya in Central America that are still there today. There's more than 5 million Mayan-speaking peoples there. And in the article, one of the guys said, I am Maya and my wife is Maya because we speak Mayan, but our kids only speak Spanish, so our kids are not Maya. So even the idea of a language can be really critical to this day, right? And then moving into it was this idea of just phenotype, right? Now, this is important, that what you hear a lot of people say is that like race isn't real, right? This meme that I found, right? Race isn't real, it's a social construct. Race is real because racism is real, right? It's not biologically meaningful. It's not biologically significant. It's not biologically a suitable way to describe or delineate human populations. But race is real. Race is absolutely real because racism is real. Because African Americans in the United States or Latinos or other groups and other populations around the world face tremendous discrimination. They face hardship. They face lots of things based on their skin color, right? Not based on their phenotypic expression of genes, right? And so it's absolutely real. This is why, African Americans and Latinos, they're pulled over more by police. Even with the same credit score, they're more likely to be denied loans at a bank. African Americans compared to whites for committing the same crime get about 20% more jail time on average, according to the Department of Justice. These kinds of things happen over and over and over again, whatever you want to talk about with schooling, with housing. There was a study that came out recently that found that if a home was being appraised and the family portraits in the home were African American, it would get appraised at something like 20 to 30% less than if they removed those pictures or replaced them with pictures of a white family, right? So, I mean, there's a myriad of ways that we can talk about housing discrimination. When applications for apartments come in that have stereotypical quote unquote black name versus white names, they face rejection at 3 to 4 times the rate. We can talk about, whatever you want to talk about, right? There's all of this body of work that's been done out there, right? This is probably the most scary, the most painful to talk about, which is the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers. One of the kind of racist narratives that you'll hear a lot now is that more whites are killed by blacks, more whites are killed by cops than blacks. Now, that is statistically true. But that's true because whites make up the vast majority of American culture, right? So yes, whites are about 52% of the individuals that are killed by police, but African Americans are about 32%, except that because of our population numbers means that blacks are statistically way more likely, right? They're 2.8 times higher among blacks than among whites, right? If you look at our total population numbers, right? Black victims are also more likely to be unarmed than whites, right? Because the reality is sometimes a police shooting is justified. Some guy pulls out a gun and tries to shoot an officer or a civilian, then yes, the police are going to kill him, right? And this is also something that they accounted for here. It's what's often called suicide by cop, where, officers have a gun pointed at them and they still go for a gun, right? Well, even then, whites were more likely to be victims than blacks there, meaning that whites were more likely to be in that population that sort of knew what they were doing and forced the situation, as opposed to African Americans, right? And so race is absolutely real, and it is a social issue that we need to come to terms with, that we need to talk about, that we need to grapple with, that we need to have a conversation on, that I think is starting to. And it's like all conversations, best when it is a conversation that is driven by fact and data, that's an important thing, okay? And so I hope that we will, moving forward, do that, right? Because I think that there's a lot of ways in which we have very subtly perpetuated racism. This photograph that I have on the screen right here is something that you've probably seen in your biology books, in your history books, in your humanities books, all of this kind of stuff that shows the quote unquote evolution of human beings, right? Well, there's a lot of things wrong with this picture, but One of them that has always stood out to me is the fact that as you look at this evolution and this idea of change, but not just change, but betterment, there's an implicit idea here that humans are getting better, right? That this is an improvement over the past. And you'll notice that the ultimate improvement in almost all of these pictures is a white man, right? Even though when humans evolved, we were all in Africa and we were all certainly dark skinned, right? And so moving forward, we do need to have these conversations. We do need to be more honest with each other. And we do need to take the time to examine this. Okay. Thank you all very much.